Okay, Richard, Marshall, thanks so much for having me. So how does one go from being a guitarist to being a luthier?
Well, necessity.
Okay.
I couldn't afford a guitar, so when I was 17, I decided I would build a guitar, and I figured how bad could it be. And after about a year struggling, I found out how bad it could be, but it didn't fly apart when I put the strings on it, so I was encouraged to keep at it, so I did.
So okay, so do you still have it?
I still have that first guitar, yes.
Okay.
And believe it or not, it's still under tension. It's been under tension constantly for 52 years.
Did you compare your first guitar to his first guitar?
I did. He said that my first guitar was a lot better, but I also had the benefit of having a lot of experience working with the repairs in the shop. So I spent, the first almost 15 years of my career doing solely repairs on other instruments, where you're making your little things inside of it match the surrounding area.
Okay. And so when did you decide that you want to be rather a luthier than, or do you still consider yourself as a
No. It wasn't a decision I made. It was a decision that was essentially thrust on me because I developed this extremely bad habit called eating, and the luthiery paid better than the play.
Okay. What a bad habit. I'm trying to get rid of it. It's horrible. It's horrible.
Some of us have conquered that.
Yeah. Well. Okay. So how did you try to balance it first the playing and
yes.
I still have nails. So
I still play for my own amusement. Yes, for a while actually I was working with an agency in Boston called Lorman and Dane, and they used to book concerts for me, but not enough to really make a living from it.
I see.
So it was close with no cigar, so I was splitting between the two. And it's very difficult because in order to play concerts, you have to have at least three separate programs in your hands at all times, ready to go depending on your audience. Whether if they're really sophisticated, you got to have a very highbrow program, and if it's not a sophisticated audience, you got to play the popular stuff. Otherwise, you're not going to be back next year.
Yeah.
And so to maintain that and try to spend 14 hours a day building guitars, you just can't do that.
14 hours.
Yeah, I work any hours I want as long as it's 14 a day.
6 days a week.
6 days a week.
So what's about the number 14?
Well, that's about all I can hold out. At my age, that's about all I can hold out with right now. That's my limit of my endurance at this point in my life. But we have to work very long hours to make this business work. It's not an 8-hour-a-day job.
I see.
And even so, at the end of the 14 hours, it's not that we turn off our brain and we stop thinking about what we're doing. We're always thinking about what we're going to be doing next. When we're doing a large restoration, we're always working through all the permutations of what can go wrong with the glue up. Because whenever we're doing a glue up, we get every single plan set in place with 3 or 4 contingencies, and much like the old saying, everybody's got a plan until you get punched in the face. In luthiery, everybody's got a plan until you spread the glue.
Yes.
Oh wow. Okay. So
that is so true.
Can you talk a little more about? Because to me it's totally new. For me, glue is the glue. You have a piece of wood, you glue them together. That's it. So what can go wrong?
Well, first of all, we only use high glue, not PVA style glue. And the reason for that is it's reversible, and it's got a very proven track record. Okay, so if you do a restoration or a repair on an instrument, you want to have the option for this to be undone as repair techniques progress beyond what we're at now. And we're at a revolution in terms of techniques and abilities, but it's still always improving. And you look at a repair that was done 10 years ago, and much like clothing style or hairstyle, you can look at it and see that it's actually a dated style of repair. So it would be nice sometimes to, especially on these historical instruments, to be able to go back and undo that and to secure it in a more modern fashion that has the potential of holding out much better than what was done that way.
I see.
So we always want to have the option to undo what has been done. The polyvinyl glues or wood glues, white glues, or God forbid the polyurethane glues.
The gorilla glue. glues.
The PVA glues or the wood glue, it works by interfacing into the wood and then using a little bit of thickness, and it keys in. As soon as you do that, the wood joint is contaminated and it can never be adequately glued again by any other glue. Fortunately, that glue is relatively reversible, but exceedingly hard and expensive to do so. The polyurethane glues, when we come across those, I've actually called the company who manufactures that, and they said, I asked them if there was some sort of solvent or something of that nature to undo this and to break that joint.
Mm-hmm.
And the answer was, well, how long do you really want to live? So the solvents required to undo a polyurethane glue joint
Mm-hmm.
are so dangerous that I'm unwilling to work with that.
Wow. Yeah, no, that's not worth it.
Right.
And we have to consider our health because we're in it for the long term here. So there's certain solvents we just don't use in the shop, and there's a limited number that we do use.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we don't really go beyond anything that's
Right.
quote unquote hardware store grade. You know.
But one of the things that's happened is that these older iconic instruments have increased in value.
Mm-hmm.
It becomes more cost effective to do the repairs correctly. 30 years ago, they weren't at a value that would warrant putting 40 or 50 hours into the instrument. And so you see a lot of cheap repairs that are done on the quick, and that's the problem. And so now that the values have increased, it makes more sense to put 40 or 50 hours or whatever it takes to do it properly. And if you look at the violin world, for instance, which you're very familiar with.
Right. In the violin world, it's not unheard of to have a multi-$100,000 or multi-million-dollar restoration on an instrument. But if you think about it, the percentage-wise, it's no different.
Right.
The typical rule of thumb that we somehow ended up at is 20%. It's 20% of the value of the instrument is what's worthwhile to spend on a repair. So if you're dealing with a $10 million instrument, spending $2.5 million on a restoration is not entirely out of the question because it's something that warrants it. When you scale that back to a guitar side, a guitar that's worth $250,000, it's not unheard of to spend $25,000, $30,000, $35,000 on restoration.
Would increase the value of the guitar stores?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
If a guitar comes in needing $25,000 to $30,000 in terms of restoration, typically that guitar is worth 1/5, 1/6 of that actual price. So it's worthwhile for that person to.
Unrestored, the value is not very high because no one wants to take the gamble on buying the proverbial pig in a poke because they don't know. But once the instrument's restored and someone can sit down and play it and say, wow, that's
a great guitar.
That's a great guitar.
Boy, really not.
Yeah. So what we do is we specialize in snatching success from the jaws of defeat.
Many of these guitars that come to us that we do the restorations on have had typically 2, maybe 3 restorations of varying quality done to them already at that point.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really at the precipice, 2 or 3 more bad repairs and it's a write-off because it's going to need $60,000 or $70,000 worth of labor to get it right. Whereas we could do it now and bring it back to 0 before too much damage has been done.
Mm-hmm.
And
sometimes they're just so wrecked that our advice is just to leave it and do nothing further.
Really?
Because anything further we do will erase even yet more remaining original information that's in the instrument.
Wow.
And it's not going to really make it at that point a better musical instrument, so what's the point?
in fact, a lot of times it's to the detriment of the overall sound when these get overly worked over to the point where you're taking away the thickness. Because a lot of these old guitars were built to the very nth degree. You lose a few tenths of a millimeter, and suddenly the wood is not structurally sound enough to maintain the tension over the long haul.
When Torres built his instruments, he used his thumb and forefinger and he flexed the wood as he thinned it. And he just knew from experience exactly how far to go and no further for that specific piece of wood by flexing it. He knew
For the top.
Yes, for the top. And so he knew right when the top was at its final, lightest, thinnest degree and still safe enough to hold the tension of the strings by experience. And he referenced that in a conversation he had with a friend of his who was a priest. Because the priest asked him over dinner, he said, Maestro, before you go to your grave, can you leave us your secret? He said, I can't. It's between my thumb and my forefinger. And I mean, we understand that perfectly, but instruments like that, you can't take those and refinish those. You destroy that.
Yeah.
And that's happened in most of them because many makers, it's like, for whatever reason, Torres and Santos are the two makers that really attract the people who want to paint mustaches on Mona Lisas. And they think, I can improve the maestro's work. This is what the maestro would have done if he'd had lacquer, or if he'd had polyurethane glue, or if he'd had this, or if he'd had that.
Or if he had some fancy machine to measure the tone.
Or if he'd had the tone generator making the glitter dance on the top, he would have made the top do this or that, and, no.
It's like any historical data or historical documents that you can sort of rely on when you.
He left us. Torres built about 325, 350 or so historical documents, of which about 100 survive, and of which I'd say a certain number, less than 100, are really good players. And those are all the historical documents that he's left behind.
I see.
Really, and for us, we've seen so many of them and handled so many of them, had so many of them open, or at least under our measurement tools, that we've compiled our own data based off of this, because no instrument that comes into our shop.
Files and files, photographs, intimate photographs from inside and out, not just mugshots.
Yeah, each file is hundreds of photos, if not more.
Yeah.
I was wondering, as a luthier, how do you think about how you want your instruments to sound like? Is it more through conversations with the players that you work with? Because you're a player. But
Absolutely. The players tell us what's good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so we try to listen.
Okay. Because there's some guitars that are out there. Usually, like a small man sounds like a small, right? The guitar I'm playing, like the hypnotic, usually they all sound like similar. So like, where do you, or should like a luthier draw the line between like, this is my model, this is how I sound like, this is like what a Brune sounds like, versus, okay, this is how my customers want it?
Well, they came to us for our sound initially. You don't go to a luthier who you don't like the sound of their instruments and well, build me this. Well, that probably won't work out all that great. Because if you don't like the way that their other instruments sound, it's not the best. So, right off the bat, by people coming to us, they're coming to us for our sound initially, and then beyond that, it's a modification.
So what we do is, we have, of course, all these historical prototypes that we're very familiar with and we admire, and those are our teachers.
Okay.
But they weren't necessarily the final end word on the instrument. So we make our own models using our knowledge of these old makers and the input we get from the players who tell us what's good and what's not good. And every player has an opinion, and each opinion is equally right. There's no wrong answer. So we build basically to make the right tool for the right player. That's what we do.
Is it like a particular?
We don't make just one set model.
Yeah.
Okay. We don't build a cookie cutter guitar. That's all we do.
Yeah.
And so we try to be very flexible, and we listen to what the player needs in terms of action, dimensions, sound, color, projection, playability, all of those very important factors. I mean, this is a difficult instrument, and everybody's hands are different. So they have the right tool.
Yeah, really, playing music is hard enough.
Yeah.
There's no need to fight the instrument.
Exactly.
Music is music. It's hard. It's everything that we embody and everything that we try to get out of ourselves. And the instrument should always be just an extension of the hand. There should never be a fight between the instrument and the player, because if you have to pay attention to the instrument and finding that, then you're taking that away from your music, and it's a barrier opposed to being a passive.
So how do you design a guitar to be most playable?
Just by a lot of feedback from our clients. They tell us, whoa, whatever you did on this guitar really worked, or maybe this isn't the best option, or maybe this isn't the best thing that you've done, but let's go back and do the other thing.
There's many factors that actually comprise what players call playability, aside from just scale length and action height. And there's the fret profiles. We have about 20 different types of fret wire we can pick from and use. Okay, and the neck profiles and the angle of the neck to the body, height of the strings above the soundboard. There's a whole plethora of things that feed into what makes a guitar playable for a particular player. And it's interesting because one player will tell you, I have to have very high frets. I can't play the guitar without high frets. And another player will come right in and say, I can't play guitar with high frets. And
Give me that mandolin one.
Yeah, they're both right. So we have to determine that. Those are our sets of instructions. It's what the players tell us they like.
Even beyond that, we find that the playability issue, some people will say that these strings feel spunky. Well, the difference between strings on one guitar and another, in terms of the actual foot-pounds of tension, doesn't change. That's pure physics. So what they're talking about is the responsiveness of the guitar. So even playability of a guitar is a determining factor upon the sound of the instrument.
Right.
So if a guitar isn't responsive, you can see some people where they're playing a less than stellar guitar, and their strings are just, you see them just grabbing at the strings and practically ripping them off the guitar.
Yes.
Whereas other times you see them and they'll just, you barely move on a guitar that's really responsive and a great guitar, and the sound just emanates and fills the room. And it's effortless. And they say, my right hand feels a lot better on this guitar, and I love how light it is on the left hand. Well, the amount of force that it takes to squeeze a string down to the fret or to activate it with your right hand, it doesn't change. That is just literal pure physics.
Yeah.
But what you're feeling is the responsiveness of the guitar, and that factors into the playability that is often not taken into account because...
And the good players can really feel that.
Yeah.
Immediately, it's just like that. They know.
So like how do you improve sustain of a guitar?
Well, there's a number of things in terms of the barring that's under the soundboard, and those basically control the sound. That and the bridge. The bridge is the single most brace, the important brace that's at the top. Yes, it's very overlooked.
It's the first interface between the movement of the strings and the top.
It transmits the vibration of the string to the soundboard.
Yeah.
The bridge is a very, very critical, very overlooked aspect.
That makes perfect sense. I thought of it.
If you want to copy a maker's sound, you have to start with their bridge. If you don't get the bridge right, it doesn't matter how correctly you got the rest of the body, it won't sound like that maker's instrument.
And that's really where a lot of each individual luthier sound comes from, because we all have our tastes and preferences for bridge style. Some people like a really stiff bridge, some people like to use this material or that material. We've seen some instruments where the bridges are sheathed or covered in something and hollowed out on the inside and filled with a different material. So that is all part of the application of the vibrations to the remainder of the instrument. And it's the first filter. It's like in electric guitar terms, it's like your pedal board.
Okay.
That affects the sound before the amp.
Okay.
And if you think about the guitar body is the amp, and the bridge and the bracing or bars
It's good pickup.
that's your pickup, and it's your effects pedals.
Okay. Wow. Interesting. So is there like one, because you're dealing with a lot of like historical instruments, is there like one particular builder that like inspired you or influenced you? Especially
To be honest, in my own instruments, because I began in the 60s, and at that time the Ramirez 1A was the dominant instrument. It was you played a Ramirez 1A or you just weren't a serious classical guitarist. And so I spent 10 years of my beginning career basically making Ramirez clones. And my model was, looks like Ramirez, sounds like Ramirez, only it's cheaper than a Ramirez. And so that was my sales hook. So the Ramirez 1A is still actually, if you look inside for instance, my artist model, you'll see, oh, okay, I see where he got his ideas from the Ramirez 1A, but they're not really copies of it, but I took inspiration from that. But we've been inspired by all the makers from Hauser, Boucher, Fleta, you name them, all these iconic makers who themselves, and these were all makers who, by the way, are coming into the period right at the beginning of the adoption of nylon as the material as opposed to gun. Because guitars from Torres' day up through World War II were pretty monolithic in their internal designs, because Torres really set the way, and his way was really the best way.
Yeah, so guys like two closing bars.
And so many makers basically imitated that in some kind of theme of variation, but when nylon came in, it's a different material, it's less dense, it doesn't have the same brightness that gut has. And so the players said to the makers, look, we're not going back to gut. It's too expensive, it doesn't stay in tune, it breaks, the dimensions, it's expensive.
And it's expensive.
So make the guitar sound with nylon the way I remember them sounding with the gut. And so that's when this explosion of experimentation and variation of bracing comes about from Fleta, Boucher, Ramirez III, and so on and so on. And we're still coming in through the tail end of that right now with these Nomex tops, the Smallman, Australian designs, and so on. People are still trying a lot of different things to see what works, what will make these things even more horsepower, more sound, more whatever. And that's great. That's how we move this art forward.
Yeah. Do you feel that there's from my experience, it seems like either you have like a muscle car in guitar, like a horsepower, or you have like a very colorful instrument. This was like my experience. What's like, if that's a spectrum, do you think, should it be in a spectrum? Is there such a spectrum? Or
the spectrum is really what the player wants,
right?
And so much of the sound of the guitar comes from the player. I think it's more of a commentary on the technique and sound that they are personally after. And what we do is we build a guitar that they tell us that they want, along with, for me, I have to like the sound of the guitar that I build. And those two items together really dictate what's going to come forward. Now, as far as the overly bright or loud, which they aren't actually as loud, because there's been some studies done with that, or the overly rich and colorful, I think that there is a blend, but I think that it takes a lot of out-of-the-box experimentation to find the right balance in between the two, so that way you're starting off with a tool that is fitted for the process. It's we talk about the horsepower versus the not. There's a huge difference between a Camry and a Dodge Demon. And what we're looking for is the mixture between that refinement and horsepower in order to be a well-balanced package.
And that said, too, we also, because of the repair and restoration work, we're always looking down the road. We never just building the tool for that player for right now. We always are working under the assumption not when the guitar, or if the guitar is going to have to be repaired, but just when, because it's inevitable.
Okay.
And so we always have to assume that if we want these things to be in circulation for generations, whereas there's no reason why they shouldn't be, we have to assume that they have to be repairable by someone who knows what they're doing, and reasonably so. And so we always build with that in mind.
Great. So let's talk a little about your collection of all those fantastic instruments.
Yeah.
Let's look at this one first here.
Yeah.
Can you? It says Untitled Torres.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about this guitar.
This was the guitar that belonged to Julio Sagreras, who was a South American virtuoso. He published method books, and of course he composed El Calibre, amongst other things. Very famous guitarist in his day. Many of the famous guitarists would try to acquire a Torres. It was a very, very prized, coveted thing for them to get because he was considered the best,
Mhm.
and he was very iconic. This Torres made guitars in many different sizes, different scale lengths. He didn't just build one cookie cutter style instrument. This guitar is probably the largest size body that he made. It's also a rosewood body.
It is smaller, right?
It's small by some guitar standards today, but this was the largest size of the Torres.
Is it like 65?
It's 25 and 11/16ths, which is almost 25 and 3/4 inches. Torres worked in inches, not metric.
Oh.
The metric system was not in place, and Torres's tools were mostly English tools because they were the pinnacle of hand tools in Torres's era.
I see.
And he was the pinnacle of craftsmanship, of skill. Very highly skilled guy. He had tremendous sharpening stones. He was able to get his plane blades to a level of sharpness that he could leave the tops off of the plane blades. He didn't sand them. They came straight off of the plane blade. They were like glistening.
Yeah, and that's when a piece of wood is just hand planed. It leaves a very distinctive signature of appearance that you don't achieve with the sandpaper.
And he had a toothed scraping plane, which was a common tool in those days, and the intervals of the teeth on it were very uniform and regular. It was not a local blacksmith made blade. It was a very expensive imported English blade.
It was a Sheffield design,
Yeah.
Sheffield, England, which is one of the great centers of musical or of metallurgy.
And those tool marks that particular blade left is one of the things we use to identify his work.
Wow. And like you see, like how we call this thing?
The tonebase. That's a brass tonebase. That was a device that
It's supposed to make the guitar sound like louder.
it's not supposed to make it louder. The idea was it was supposed to take the sound and focus it and funnel it directionally, I believe.
But in practice, it actually changes the diameter or the volumetric level of the instrument, creating a deeper tone. So
it lowers the pitch of the guitar.
It's a tonal aesthetic more so than a funneling or megaphone device.
What it did is it made it very difficult to get into the instrument to do any mischief inside
or snooping.
if you didn't know how to deal with them. There is actually a way to deal with those if you have to get inside, but most people don't know that.
And I guess you would need to kill me.
We don't like to do it. It's not an easy thing to do.
It's not as reversible as we would like it to be.
Okay. So how did the change from like gut strings to like nylon influence the course of the history?
That was a major watershed moment in the advancement of the guitar, because the gut strings were ubiquitous up until nylon came in. Now, nylon was an accidental discovery by a guy named Julian Hill who worked for the DuPont company. And at first they didn't think it had any value. And then as they worked with it, they realized this was a fiber that was going to replace silk. And of course, if you know your history, this nylon was introduced in 1939 into commerce. And of course, the U.S. went into the war in 1941. And the supplies of silk were cut off from the U.S. Parachutes, all those kinds of things, they were made out of nylon.
Oh.
Nylon was the thread by which we hung. Can you imagine that? So when the nylon, of course, they went into fishing line, and one of the first places it went to was in all the fishing villages, particularly in the south of Spain. And the gypsies in the south of Spain, which is where flamenco was prevalent, quickly discovered that if they got the right size fishing line, they could put it on their guitars, it lasted forever, and they could beat the crap out of it, and it would take it. The gut strings wouldn't last any time at all. Gut was very expensive. A year's supply of gut would cost more than the guitars cost for a player who was playing regularly. So it was very expensive. It was never an everyman's instrument. So when nylon came in, that really changed it. But the problem was nylon is less dense than gut. Gut is like 1.12 grams per cubic centimeter. Nylon is 1.08. There's about a 10% difference. So the nylon has to be thicker to produce the same tension that the gut string had. And when it becomes thicker, the guitar is not as bright. So the makers began experimenting with their bracing, and this is when, after World War II, this is when nylon started to be marketed as a guitar string material. That's when you see makers all of a sudden trying all kinds of different bracing patterns and different systems. They're trying to get the guitar to sound with nylon the way the players remembered it sounded with gut.
So was Albert Augustin the first one to commercially?
No, he was not the first, but he was probably the most successful.
Mm-hmm.
Albert Augustin himself was a guitar maker,
Mm-hmm.
struggling with that, and his wife was a chemist who I believe actually worked with DuPont or knew DuPont, the company. Anyway, they got some of the early supplies of the fishing line and began packaging it and selling it with Segovia's picture, which was a very good move. But it's, there were other people, but that were more obscure who were trying to market it in packages before that, but they were the ones who did it in a big way.
Mm-hmm.
So, and were very successful at it. So,
at this point in time, nylon is nylon. You go onto the internet forums, and I don't want to say anybody's wrong per se, but there's 3 manufacturers of nylon worldwide. But basically, 2 of them are the suppliers for everything that we use. So, a first string is a first string, and what you have to do is look at the diameter, and that diameter will tell you exactly the properties of the string. It's not that so-and-so has one special blend of nylon and so-and-so has another special blend of nylon. It's like saying, this blend of 2 oxygens and a hydrogen is exactly the right blend. It's a chemical reaction.
Yeah, nylon is it's a patented substance of the known chemical formula. There's actually two types of nylon. There's a hard and a soft version.
Mm-hmm.
But there are other materials that are nylon-like,
Mm-hmm.
which are now also being used for guitar strings too.
Like titanium.
Well, they have the so-called carbon strings, which are a fluorocarbon, which they actually don't have. They don't have black carbon in it. It's kind of a misnomer. But at any rate, those are even higher density than gut.
Yeah.
So there's many options that players have today, which is great, but it complicates it for us because we have to not only find out what a player likes for his guitar, we also have to know what they like for their strings.
Do you recommend?
We recommend you use whatever string works best for you. That's what we recommend.
We say go to your favorite place, buy 2 or 3 sets of everything that they've got. Maybe not all at one time, unless you want them to take you out to dinner for a place that's such a huge order. But go check out various tensions and check out various permutations because each string has its own unique feel, and really with a lot of these, so the nylon trebles are more or less the same between all brands, but the differentiating factor is the basses.
Yeah.
And look for a bass string that complements your playing style. I personally like a string that's wound a little bit tighter. When you see it unwound, it stands out pretty straight. Some people like a little bit of a gummier string, but again, this is all personal preference.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't recommend any string in particular. We recommend that you find the string that works for you, because my playing is very different from his playing, which is very different from your playing.
The beauty is guitarists have all these choices today, and they're all good.
Right.
I remember when I was making guitars, I started out like 50 some odd years ago, there were only 2 kinds of strings, good ones and bad ones, and most of them were bad ones, even the good ones. So I would have to buy a certain brand, I'd have to buy 3 or 4 sets before I got one set on the guitar that actually played in tune.
Wow.
And I would leave that set on until it was shredded.
Well, the Guild of American Luthiers, it's a trade organization for luthiers where we go and we talk guitars and tell each other why they're wrong and what they think and what they know to be true. But there's many lectures given on experience, and at that point in time, they had lectures on how to properly tune a string to figure out where its enharmonicity is to get it to not play false.
Yeah, you can correct a false string by sanding, where what the reason a string is false is that the weight is not distributed uniformly along its vibrating length. So if one side is heavier than the other, if you lighten that up by sanding, you can actually correct that.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's a waste of time. I mean, strings are so cheap, why bother? But back in the old days when that's where the way strings were, take it or leave it, that was what we used to do to fix it.
And now you can go out and buy just, generic $10, $12 set strings that are every bit as good as strings that you would also pay $25 for 10 years ago.
Yeah.
So we're really in a beautiful era where you have a lot of possibilities and choices and materials and winding styles that are relatively inexpensive. Even the most expensive sets of strings are inexpensive compared to other instruments. A violin set of strings is, a cheap set is like $60 to $70, and a good set's, close to $200. When I was in college as a violin performance major, my rent was $300 a month. My car payment was $127 a month, and I went through 4 sets of strings a month. So I was spending.
He has acid rain.
I also play fingerboards, but that's a whole
Yeah.
So the pantheon of choices for strings is so wide that I can't put my name behind, put myself behind one and say this is it, and if you use anything else, you're wrong.
Yeah.
Just try it.
Yeah,
Like
one thing I would say is the guitarists need to be really judicious about how they tie their strings on the bridge, so that they don't let fly and get what I call the weed whacker ding behind the bridge, which is when the string unravels while you're bringing it up to pitch. It's a very common problem, and particularly with the so-called carbon trebles, the fluorocarbon ones, they're slipperier, and so they have to be really securely tied and make sure they don't slip. And same up with the machine head. Many guitarists will wrap the whole dead end of the string around the roller, and that's bad for 2 reasons. Number one, it can corkscrew out or in against the head and foul up against the edges. And number two, when you're turning your machine head mechanism, particularly if you've neglected to put oil on it, which is 99% of the guitars, that wears out the mechanism more quickly. So you want to pull all the string through and just wrap it a couple of times and hold the excess while you get it started. After it's on there, clip off the excess. The strings are so cheap, you don't need to keep that excess in case the string breaks and you want to scoot it down, which is what I used to do when I was a kid.
The weed whacker effect is particularly magnified with the 12-hole style bridges, because it's really difficult to actually tie a proper knot or get the appropriate level of lock on it. And whenever I'm doing those, I like to leave at least 1.5 inches of string behind the bridge or the knot that I tie it. I don't just flip it under with a 12-hole. I have a fairly complex knot that I tie behind the bridge, just because I'm paranoid. And if you leave a string ding on your own personal guitar, I'm sorry, but that's your problem. If I leave a string ding on somebody else's guitar, then I have a very big problem.
Right.
So
we're very sensitive to that kind of thing. And those weed whacker dings are really hard to hide on the top. That's a very difficult thing to do.
Yeah, and you really can't pass it off as a beauty mark either. Cindy Crawford has her beauty mark or whatever. You can't have a beauty mark of a. As soon as I see that, I just think that's a.
Right. So before we wrap up, what is a few words to this beauty here?
Yeah, it's a Cordoba C9.
That's a really, really pristine 1939 Hauser.
Wow.
And Hauser made guitars in the Germanic style, and when he met Segovia, Segovia finally ordered a guitar from him, and he became inspired to build the Spanish models. Although Hauser was very familiar with the Spanish models because he had known Miguel Gobet. In fact, he had taken a pattern off of Miguel Gobet's Torres guitar around 1912, which was in a shop. But he never built a copy of it. But Segovia came along, was inspired, and thought Hauser had, something.
That little special something that one takes.
Yeah, the special something that it takes. And so he allowed Hauser to take measurements of his 1912 model Hermann, which is now at the Metropolitan Museum. And of course, that guitar was actually built by Santos Hernandez, who was working for Hermann at the time. He was the head of the shop. And using that as sort of the basis, Hauser began building Spanish models from there going forward. In his entire lifetime, Hauser Sr., along with Hauser II, who began assisting him in 1930, according to Hauser II, they made about 400 guitars in the Spanish style.
Okay.
And they never stopped making the Viennese model.
You can go to any of the surviving Hausers now and still
Or still order that model, which is the one with the detachable neck and the floating fingerboard, and sort of pinched waist, the figure 8 shape.
With the Hauser patent bracing.
With the Hauser patent bracing and so on, yeah. So anyway, they're relatively rare, but superlative workmanship, and because Hauser knew nothing of flamenco, he wasn't really influenced by the flamenco players in that aesthetic. And so as a German, he looked at the tops of the Torreses and the Manuel Ramirez's and those Santoses and those guitars, and I'm sure he must have thought, that's way too thin.
Well,
So he made his tops much more robust.
it parallels the same school of thought with the Germanic violins of that era.
Versus the Italian instruments.
Right.
Yeah.
Opposed to the Spanish or the Italian, the Italian violins had super thin tops and super thick backs for the most part. The German violins had super thick tops and super thin backs. And it's really the same thought process in the Torres versus the Hauser. Internally, this Hauser and the Torres are virtually identical.
Yeah, they're very similar.
So what you're hearing is the difference of the bridge and the top and the back.
Yeah. But it was interesting because he didn't really know anything about flamenco. He ended up creating a guitar that was for a player like Segovia, playing the material Segovia was playing. It was really the ideal right tool. And I could see why Segovia latched on to that instrument. He actually owned a number of Hausers, not just that 37 that he talked about. So he was a de facto dealer as much as anything. But I could see why that instrument appealed to him, and he played that for a good 25 years in his career.
And I suppose we should mention that this guitar in particular, as opposed to a Hauser, the broad spectrum, beyond pristine, I don't think that goes to say how close to original it is. It's got no cracks, no repairs. It's got
Finish has never been touched.
The finish has never been touched. It's got the original nut, saddle, and frets. I mean, this is it's a real diamond that is just found out of nowhere, really.
Yeah.
And typically the machines on these get cracked up really badly because the plastic technology and chemistry was not as dialed in as it is now. So the rollers often cracked and would discolor, and this doesn't even have that. But we know it's the original set of machines that went with the instrument. So it's of the pristine, it is the most pristine, or one of the most pristine of the pristine.
Well, on that note, 2 beautiful guitars.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks.